What's going on, everyone? Today we have the item guide for set 10. We're going to be going over a bunch of item recommendations we're going to have for every single champion. So here are a few things to keep in mind before we get into it, because set 10 changes the way we approach items. So this set is pretty flexible because of the headliner mechanic, and that means that you need to be slamming items as early as possible, and best in slot items are a little more difficult to get right now. So I've categorized items into 4 different categories: tank items, AP items, AD items, damage amplification, and survivability. That's actually 5. And you should be slamming these so-called generic items based on whatever you're going. So on all your tanks, you should slam generic tank items such as Redemption, Steadfast Heart, Dragon Claw, Bramble Vest, Adaptive Helm, Protector's Vow, Gargoyle, Stoneplate, and Sunfire Cape. For AP, you should be slamming either AP damage items or mana items such as Archangels, Shojin, Blue Buff, Jeweled Gauntlet, Nashor's Tooth, and Rabadon's Death Cap. For attack damage, you should be slamming items such as Last Whisper, Rageblade, Runon's Infinity Edge, and Deathblade. But there are also other general damage amplification items which works on all damage types, and that's going to be Guardbreaker, Giant Slayer, and Hand of Justice. And lastly, we have this weird category for melee carries. This is going to allow them to survive a lot longer than they normally would, and melee carries typically need this to kind of make them not die right away. So that's going to be Sterix Gauge, Edge of Night, Crown Guard, Quicksilver, Titans, Bloodthirster, and Hextech Gunblade. Obviously, some of these categories can go into other places. For example, a lot of AP champions might want a lot of attack speed from the Rageblade. Maybe an AD champion wants to use the Shojin because they're reliant on casting a bunch. So there is a lot of overlap in some of these categories, but in general, these are going to be what I refer to when I say generic AP items, for example. Another thing to note is that on every single champion, which we'll go over in just a bit, I am not going to list tank items because mostly you're going to be putting generic tank items on them, and then their second or third item is going to be a specific item that counters your lobby, because that's ideally how you want to play tanks. So just as a quick rundown for all the tank items, Warmogs is good for tanks with a lot of resistances. Redemption is good if you're playing a comp with a lot of melee units. Steadfast Heart is good for tanks with methods to avoid the thresholds, such as shielding from Guardians. Dragonclaw, good against AP teams, also good for tanks with high health pools and need regeneration. Bramble Vest, good against physical. Adaptive, good if you have an impactful ability that you can cast multiple times per fight. Protector's Vow, great for tanks that need their first cast as soon as possible. Gargoyle Stoneplate, good for teams with a few melee units. Even Shroud, utility tank item that's used with AD teams. Titan's Resolve, good if you have a tank that can also do damage. Ionic Spark, same thing as Even Shroud but with AP teams, good for magic resist shredding. And then lastly, Sunfire Cape is another utility tank item. That's good if you need anti-heal or wound effect. But let's get into the champions right now. So in the tier 1, we have the tanks on the top left. So again, generic tank items on them. We have the melee carries on the top right, AP damage dealers on the bottom right, and then AD on the bottom left. One cost is a little bit weird. Unless you're building a team around them, you typically don't want to itemize them in the late game, but if you're using them as temporary item holders, they're going to be perfect for you to put whatever you want on them, including items that don't necessarily belong on them. So for example, if you're playing Evelynn and you have the Evelynn headliner and you're using her temporarily, if you have something like a Spear of Shojin, you could always just throw it on her. Maybe the Spear of Shojin goes on someone in a different comp later on, but in the early game, you have a lot of different slots open for your champion, so you could just throw whatever items you have. I recommend putting them on whoever you have 2-starred, but if you are going for like 3-star carries, some inspiration. Again, these items aren't going to be stuff that you're going to be building all the time, but it's just to kind of get the juices flowing, and it's going to change on patch to patch. But for melee carries such as like Olaf or Yasuo, you typically want some sort of defensive items on them, such as healing from Bloodthirster. I know Olaf does have built-in healing as well, but also like some sort of scaling item in the Titan's Resolve which gives survivability is also pretty good. Other things to consider is like Edge of Night or Quicksilver, as we talked about before, and you could also just put generic attack damage items on them. Those are going to work out pretty fine. Evelynn is the same thing but for AP, so she's going to want stuff like AP items such as Archangels, Crown Guard, that's a great melee survivability item for AP units. And she could also mix and match some tank items such as an Ionic Spark because that does boost her damage up a little bit. For the backline AP carries, you're going to want 1 mana regeneration item plus damage items. So for example, you could do Spear of Shojin plus some other stuff. If you're playing Nami in the late game, something like a support item such as a Static Shiv could work too because she reduces the magic resistance of the enemy team. and you don't want to clog up your main carry's items all the time, so you could throw it on her if you really want. Annie likes Gnasher's Tooth because she likes to cast a lot, because she gets a bonus after a couple of casts. And then you could finish them off with generic AP items. For AD users, stuff like Rage Blade, Last Whisper, Giant Slayer, Runons, Deathblade, Infinity Edge, all of those are going to work, just the generic items that you saw before. You pretty much just mix and match them. But let's move on into tier 2s. Same thing with the tanks on the top left. Pantheon, Gragas, and Garen going to be holding that. For the melee carries, Gnar, you see the same pattern. BT, Titans. Of course, you could use the other stuff we mentioned before, such as Edge of Night or just AD items. Jax can use something like Jeweled Gauntlet and Hand of Justice. Katarina, same thing. Maybe add like more AP on her with the Archangels. And one thing I want to note is that with crit builds, adding more crit is really beneficial. So if you have a Jeweled Gauntlet, or if you're playing an Executioner, adding in an item that gives additional crit is really useful, such as Guardbreaker, Hand of Justice, Quicksilver, literally anything that you build from a glove, even something like a Last Whisper. Obviously that would be for attack damage compositions. They're going to work out great because it gives a pretty big bonus to your Jeweled Gauntlet or Infinity Edge. For the AP carries at 2 costs, again, mana regeneration is really popular, so adding in like a Spear of Shojin's pretty nice. Some of these do like attack speed because they like scaling into the later parts of the game, so getting a Rage Blade works on both AD and AP units. It's honestly a pretty good flex item depending on what comp you're running. And of course, generic AP items such as like Jeweled Gauntlet, Hat are going to work out great. Bard, Shojin, he likes to cast a lot. And then for the AD carries in Kai'Sa, Twitch, and Aphelios, we have stuff like Rage Blade, Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, Deathblade. The generic damage items work as well. But hopefully you're noticing some patterns already. Same thing for tier 3s. Amumu, Echo, Neeko, and Set gonna take all your tank items. Again, if you're playing Guardians in Amumu or Neeko, maybe Steadfast Heart is gonna get like slightly more value on them. But if you're playing for the early game, which most people should be doing, you need to be slamming items, and you don't get a choice on what items you get to slam because it's kind of in the definition of slamming. You just build items to get as much value as you can out of them. For the AD carries, Edge of Night, BT, Sterix, Crown Guard, Ionic Spark, depends if you're going AD or AP. Quicksilver's pretty nice if you don't want to get them interrupted. And then in the back, we have Lulu, Vex, Lux. Lux and Vex are used more for like their carry potential, so I like putting 1 mana item on them plus 2 damage. And then for Lulu, you just want her to cast a bunch, so like a Shojin is good, and then maybe some support through the Static Shiv. For the AD carries, again, same items. Generic AD and attack speed items are going to work out great. It does depend on what build you're running, so one thing that I forgot to mention before is you need to build your units differently based on what traits you have, so there's no such thing as like an always best in slot in a lot of cases, because in the example of, let's say, Yasuo, so with Yasuo, he might have a different build for when you go true damage Yasuo versus Edgelord Yasuo, because there are a lot of different ways to build your characters in TFT, and typically getting a little bit of each stat is going to be the best way to do it. So if you're going for a lot of attack damage and Yasuo scales off of attack damage, you might want to mix in some attack speed to amplify that attack damage as well. After that, you want to add in stuff like crit, among other things. I go over that in my Fundamentals of TFT video, where I talk about different things that you need from your damage carries, such as raw stats from AD and AP, faster casting or faster attack speed, critical strike chance, resistance shredding, anti-heal, damage amp, and also the ability to deal damage. That's one distinction we have from the range units versus the melee units, is that range units are able to hold 3 damage items because they are safe because of their range. Melee units might need something like a Quicksilver or Edge of Night or Sterix or like a Bloodthirster just to be able to live. Let's move on into the tier 4. Tier 4 is going to be the bread and butters for a lot of comps. The tanks we have are Blitzcrank, Zac, Poppy, and Thresh. For the melee damage dealers, we have Akali, both Akalis actually, Viego, and Zed. And then for the AP carries, we have stuff like Karthus, Twisted Fate, and Ahri. And then for the AD champs, we have Caitlyn and Ezreal. And again, same with all the other champions we've gone over before. In TFT, things don't really change that much. For your AP damage dealers, for example, the pattern pretty much is always 1 mana regeneration item such as Shojin or Blue Buff, and then 2 damage items. Which item it is doesn't really matter in a lot of cases. Obviously, there are some cases where Blue Buff is better versus Shojin, maybe Jeweled Gauntlet is better in some situations versus Hat, but again, in this set, I want you all to focus on just slamming items because you are going to be changing your team comps a lot more than you were before. Also, feel free to experiment with different builds. A lot of people, they only build one build every single time, and that's not like a good way to get better at the game. You have to build different things and figure out when each build works based on how your game is going. So some games you're going to have a lot of AoE damage through random sources, and then maybe something like a Runons is nice to clean units up. But maybe other games you don't want the Runons and you just want pure attack speed instead, so you build a red buff or a rage blade to get extra attack speed for more damage. Again, it's really dependent on what types of teams you're facing and what your current board always is, because we can't get a picture perfect build every single time if you look at my meta snapshot on the tier list at bunnymuffins.lol. Of course, we would love to copy the builds that we see here. In a lot of the games we play, we're rolling down and we don't hit some of the champions that we see. That's obviously going to cause a lot of changes in your game plan, including your itemization. Next up, we have the tier 5s. Tier 5s is when it gets a little funky because these units are so different in a lot of cases that the general rules sometimes don't apply. Luckily for Alawi, she's just a tank, so you could throw whatever on her. Yorick is a different story though. I've seen him with tank builds, I've seen him with damage builds, I've seen him with the melee builds. He kind of can use everything, and some champions are sort of like that. Kiana likes a little bit of survivability, Kayn same thing, and then in the back, Sona is a little bit different. She loves casting, so if the item doesn't help her cast, it's kind of a useless item. Shojin is great for that reason, Rageblade is great for that reason too because they both help her cast faster, and then maybe something like an Archangel's might be better than a Deathcap because she takes so long to ramp up that the AP generally at the end of the day is going to have a much bigger effect from the Archangels versus the Hat. Obviously, you could also do the math to figure that out, but she typically has a lot more power later in the fight. Ziggs is returning back to basics, mana regen plus damage items. Jhin, kind of same thing, but he likes to cast a little bit, so I think the Shojin is actually pretty useful on him. He also likes ramping items, so having some sort of healing on him is pretty decent because he does become a monster at the end of the fight, so you might want like a Hand of Justice, Hextech Gunblade, things like that. Spirit Shojin does help him cast faster too, but again, you don't need any of the items you see listed here. You could just put 3 generic attack damage items on him and he's gonna do just fine. Lucian, sort of the same story there, but I do like having the red buff on him quite a bit. But hopefully this guide kind of helps you see what items are good on each champion. Again, we're gonna be super flexible this set because of the way headliners kind of work. So you need to know what the generic tank items are, what the generic AP items are, AD, mixed damage amplification, and the survivability items are in order to truly succeed. And then as patches go on, you must know which items are going to be good on that patch. So you could get that from the meta snapshot in a lot of cases because we update the items on the champions very often, but there are going to be a lot of cases where, for example, Steadfast Heart might be much better than Redemption. So maybe on that patch, we don't build Redemption as much and we build Steadfast Heart a little bit more often. This can go for any of the other categories that we talked about before. So I think this is like a pretty decent update for the item guide from before. I think before I always said like build these 3 items or like build these 2 items and then like flex the last one. But in set 10, most items are playable on most champions if it's within their theme. Because the AP item users, they just want 1 mana regen plus 2 damage. The AD, they could use all sorts of AD items. The melee units, they could use all sorts, same with the tanks. And it's a much easier way to kind of approach the game because a lot of people, they stress a lot about getting perfect items and you really don't need that in TFT, especially in this set. So maybe this is a set where people actually learn how to play the game instead of just forcing the same builds every single time. But hopefully some of the items that I listed out on the champions kind of inspire you to like try certain things or try certain builds, and then you'll kind of know when they work in different scenarios. But that's going to be it for me today for this item guide. I hope to see you all in future videos, and if you want to check out the fundamentals of TFT that we pulled up earlier, check out this video over here.